I never imagined that a single envelope would completely rewrite everything I thought I knew about my place in this world. My name is Amanda Torres, and 24 hours ago, I sat in a crowded community center watching my father publicly declare that having me was the worst decision he'd ever made. Today, I'm holding legal documents that prove he spent the last 15 years of his life making sure I'd never doubt my worth again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of the Lakewood Community Center cast harsh shadows across the folding tables, decorated with faded streamers and plastic tablecloths. The annual Torres family reunion had always felt more like an endurance test than a celebration. But this year carried an extra weight of dread that I couldn't quite shake. At 32, I had mastered the art of surviving these gatherings by keeping my head down, contributing to conversations when directly addressed, and counting the hours until I could escape back to my quiet apartment in Capitol Hill. My father, Robert Torres, held court at the head table like a king surveying his domain. At 68, he still commanded attention with his booming voice and decisive gestures, the same qualities that had built Torres Construction Company from a small Denver operation into one of Colorado's most successful commercial building firms. His thick gray hair was perfectly styled, his polo shirt pressed to crisp perfection, and his gold watch caught the light as he gestured emphatically while recounting some business triumph to anyone within earshot. To his right sat my brother, Kevin, 34 and glowing with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the family hierarchy. Kevin had inherited our father's broad shoulders and commanding presence, along with the unshakable belief that success was his birthright. As vice president of Torres Construction, he wore his authority like a tailored suit, comfortable and undeniable. His wife Jessica laughed at his jokes with practiced timing, their twin daughters playing at their feet in matching sundresses that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. My mother, Patricia, fluttered between tables with nervous energy, her smile bright but strained as she ensured everyone had enough potato salad and that the conversation stayed safely away from topics that might trigger one of my father's legendary outbursts. At 65, she had perfected the role of peacekeeper, smoothing over tensions with forced cheerfulness and strategic topic changes. Her graying hair was pulled back in the same style she'd worn for 20 years, and her floral dress was carefully chosen to be festive but not attention-grabbing. I sat at the far end of the room with my sister Nicole, who had driven up from Colorado Springs with her husband Mark and their teenage son David. Nicole was the middle child, 3 years younger than Kevin and 2 years older than me, occupying that strange family position of being neither the golden child nor the designated disappointment. She had built a comfortable life, teaching high school biology and coaching the Science Olympiad team, achievements that earned polite acknowledgement from our parents, but never the enthusiastic celebration that greeted Kevin's quarterly profit reports. The contrast between my life and Kevin's had been a recurring theme throughout our childhood, but it had crystallized into something more pointed in recent years. While Kevin had been handed a vice presidency at Torres Construction despite his business degree from a mediocre state school, I had earned my PhD in biomedical engineering from the University of Colorado and now worked as a senior researcher at the Denver Medical Research Institute. My work on developing less invasive cardiac monitoring devices had been featured in several prestigious journals and had attracted interest from major medical device manufacturers. Yet somehow, in the geography of family dynamics, my achievements always seemed to exist in a different category than Kevin's, less real, less valuable, less worthy of pride. The reunion followed its usual pattern for the first few hours. Distant relatives I saw once a year asked polite questions about my work, their eyes glazing over when I mentioned biomedical engineering. They seemed more comfortable discussing Kevin's latest construction projects, which they could visualize driving past on their way to work. Children ran between tables while adults exchanged updates about divorces, promotions, health scares, and vacation plans. The conversations had a rehearsed quality, covering familiar territory with practiced efficiency. My Aunt Helen, my father's younger sister, sat across from me picking at her barbecue with obvious discomfort. Helen had always been different from the rest of the Torres family, quieter and more observant, working as a social worker in Pueblo, rather than pursuing the kind of high-visibility success that my father valued. Her son Tyler, my cousin, had followed her lead into social work, specializing in family counseling. Helen caught my eye several times throughout the afternoon, offering small smiles that seemed to carry an unspoken understanding. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation gradually shifted toward family history and memories. Someone brought up the photo albums, and soon the tables were covered with pictures spanning decades of Torres family gatherings. Kevin dominated these reminiscences, his childhood stories told and retold with increasing embellishment. The time he scored the winning touchdown in high school, his acceptance to business school, his first big construction deal, his wedding to Jessica, the birth of his daughters. Each milestone was presented as evidence of the Torres family's continued success and upward trajectory. My own milestones appeared in these narratives as footnotes, if at all. My high school valedictory speech was mentioned briefly, primarily as context for Kevin's athletic achievements the same year. My full scholarship to the University of Colorado was noted but quickly overshadowed by discussion of Kevin's business internships. My doctoral graduation wasn't represented in the photo albums at all, an omission that hadn't occurred to me until I watched my extended family flip through years of carefully curated memories. The shift in atmosphere was gradual but unmistakable. What had begun as general family reminiscing slowly evolved into something more pointed, with my father increasingly taking center stage. His voice grew louder and more authoritative as he shared his philosophy on family, success, and the importance of understanding one's role in the larger picture. The relatives who had been chatting among themselves gradually turned their attention toward his impromptu speech, recognizing the transition from casual conversation to something more formal. "Children are a reflection of their parents," my father declared, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Some children understand their responsibilities to the family name and work to build something meaningful. Others get distracted by academic pursuits that sound impressive but don't contribute to the real world." He gestured toward Kevin with obvious pride. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kevin has always understood what it means to be a Torres. He's built on what I started, expanded our reach, secured our future. That's what family legacy is about. The room had grown quieter, with even the children seeming to sense the shift in energy. I felt the familiar knot forming in my stomach, the same sensation I'd experienced countless times throughout my childhood when family gatherings took this particular turn. My father had a gift for delivering criticism that sounded like objective observation, making his targets feel foolish for taking offense at what he presented as simple truth. Nicole reached under the table to squeeze my hand, her touch offering silent support. She had witnessed these moments before, the way family celebrations could suddenly transform into platforms for my father's assessments of his children's comparative worth. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of sympathy and resignation, the expression of someone who had learned to recognize the pattern but felt powerless to interrupt it. Now, some people might say, "I've been too hard on Amanda over the years." My father continued, his tone taking on the reasonable cadence of someone making a balanced assessment. "But the truth is, I've tried to guide her toward practical decisions that would benefit the whole family. Instead, she's chosen to pursue expensive education and research work that keeps her isolated from real family responsibilities." He paused, surveying the room to ensure he had everyone's attention. "I'll be honest with all of you," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Having Amanda was probably the biggest mistake Patricia and I ever made. We put years of resources into someone who would never contribute to the family business or understand what we were trying to build. Kevin has given us grandchildren and a legacy. Nicole at least chose a respectable profession that serves the community. But Amanda? She spent her entire adult life in laboratories and libraries, pursuing knowledge that benefits strangers rather than family. The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and flooding my system with a combination of humiliation and rage. The room fell completely silent, even the children stopping their play to stare at the adults whose conversation had taken such a dramatically serious turn. I could feel the eyes of 24 relatives fixed on me, waiting to see how I would respond to being publicly declared my father's greatest regret. My mother's face had gone pale, her mouth opening and closing without sound as she struggled to process what her husband had just announced to their entire extended family. Kevin looked uncomfortable for the first time all day, his usual confident demeanor cracking slightly as he realized that even he hadn't anticipated this level of public humiliation being directed at his sister. Jessica's hand moved instinctively to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. But it was Nicole's reaction that cut deepest. Tears had begun forming in her eyes, and her grip on my hand tightened as if she could somehow anchor me against the storm of humiliation that was washing over our table. Her husband Mark looked stricken, clearly caught between his desire to defend me and his awareness that challenging my father in this setting would only escalate the situation. Aunt Helen's face had transformed completely, her usual quiet demeanor, replaced by something fierce and protective. She was staring at my father with an expression I had never seen before, a combination of disgust and barely contained fury that suggested years of suppressed observations were finally reaching their breaking point. Her son Tyler was leaning forward in his chair, his professional training in family dynamics clearly alerting him to the psychological violence that was unfolding in front of him. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, as my father seemed to realize that his words had created a more dramatic impact than he might have intended. But rather than offering any form of apology or clarification, he doubled down on his position, his expression settling into the stubborn determination that had always characterized his approach to conflict. "I've said what needed to be said," he declared, crossing his arms over his chest. "Sometimes truth is uncomfortable, but that doesn't make it less true. This family has been built on hard work and practical decisions. Amanda has chosen a different path, and we all have to live with the consequences of that choice." The urge to flee was overwhelming, every instinct screaming at me to escape this nightmare before it could get any worse. But something deeper held me in place, a stubborn refusal to give my father the satisfaction of watching me run away from his public character assassination. Instead, I found myself standing slowly, my chair scraping against the linoleum floor in the oppressive silence. "Thank you for making your feelings so clear," I said, my voice steadier than I had expected it to be. "I appreciate finally knowing where I stand in this family." My words were quiet, but carried clearly in the hushed room, meeting my father's eyes, directly for what felt like the first time in years. Without another word, I gathered my purse and walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing in the silent community center. I could hear Nicole calling my name behind me, but I didn't trust myself to stop and respond without completely breaking down in front of the entire Torres family reunion. The late afternoon Colorado sun was blindingly bright after the fluorescent lighting of the community center, and I stood in the parking lot for a moment, breathing deeply and trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed with a text message from Nicole. "Don't let him destroy you. You're worth so much more than his opinion." Her words provided a small anchor of sanity in the chaos of emotions that were threatening to overwhelm me. Another message followed quickly. "I'm leaving too. Mark is getting David and we'll be right out. You don't have to face this alone." As I drove back toward Denver, my hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel, I tried to make sense of the magnitude of what had just occurred. In 32 years of navigating my father's disappointment and criticism, I had never experienced anything quite so public and definitive. The carefully maintained fiction that we were a normal family with typical sibling dynamics had been shattered in front of aunts, uncles, cousins, and in-laws who would now carry this story forward into their own families and social circles. The humiliation was profound, but underneath it was something else, something that felt almost like relief. For years, I had wondered if I was being overly sensitive about my father's treatment, if the subtle but consistent message that I didn't quite measure up was something I was imagining or exaggerating. The public declaration that I was his biggest mistake had removed all ambiguity from the situation. There was no longer any need to wonder about my place in the family hierarchy, or to hope that someday my achievements might earn the kind of recognition that Kevin received automatically. My apartment in Capitol Hill felt like sanctuary when I finally reached it. The quiet, book-filled space reflected my actual interests and values rather than the version of myself I tried to present at family gatherings. My walls were covered with my diplomas, professional awards, and photographs from research conferences where my work had been celebrated by colleagues who understood its significance. Here, surrounded by evidence of my actual accomplishments and the respect of my professional community, my father's assessment seemed less like objective truth and more like the opinion of someone who had never really tried to understand who I was or what I was trying to accomplish. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my couch, staring at my phone as messages continued to arrive from Nicole, offering support and expressing her own shock at what had transpired. My mind kept returning to Aunt Helen's expression during my father's speech, the way her face had transformed from polite family gathering attendance to something much more serious and concerned. There had been recognition in her eyes, as if she had been waiting for this moment, dreading it but not surprised by its arrival. As evening fell over Denver, I found myself thinking about the next day's plan. My father's lawyer, Mr. Harrison, Blackwell, had called earlier in the week to schedule a meeting regarding what he had described as important family business. The timing had seemed coincidental when I first received the call, but now I wondered if there was some connection between the lawyer's mysterious meeting and the unusually hostile tone of today's family reunion. Whatever Mr. Blackwell wanted to discuss, it seemed unlikely to improve my standing in the Torres family dynamics. The wine helped calm my nerves, but couldn't quiet the questions that kept circling through my mind. Had my father planned his public humiliation, or had it been a spontaneous expression of feelings he had been harboring for years? How would this change my relationship with Nicole, who had witnessed the entire spectacle? Would Kevin feel guilty about his favored status? Or would he simply accept it as confirmation of what he had always known about the family pecking order? Most importantly, what was I supposed to do with the definitive knowledge that my father considered my entire existence? A mistake? The question felt too large to address in a single evening, but as I prepared for bed, I found myself making a decision. Tomorrow's meeting with Mr. Blackwell would be my last official Torres family obligation. After that, I would need to seriously consider what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to maintain with people who saw my life's work as a selfish waste of family resources and my existence as fundamentally regrettable. The night was restless, filled with fragments of dreams where I was trying to explain my research to relatives who kept interrupting to ask why I hadn't chosen something more practical, more family-oriented, more worthy of the Torres name. I woke several times, each time initially confused about why I felt so heavy with sadness before remembering the events of the previous day. By morning, the shock had begun to transform into something else, something that felt like determination, mixed with curiosity about what revelations the day might bring. The morning air in downtown Denver carried an unusual crispness for late September, hinting at the mountain winter that would arrive in just a few months. I stood outside the imposing glass building that housed Blackwell and Associates, checking my watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The appointment wasn't until 10 o'clock, but I had arrived early, needing the extra time to compose myself after the emotional devastation of yesterday's family reunion. My reflection in the building's lobby windows showed someone who looked far more composed than I felt. I had chosen my outfit carefully, a navy blue blazer over a white blouse and dark slacks, professional but not overly formal. After my father's public declaration that I was his biggest mistake, I felt compelled to present myself as the successful, accomplished woman my education and career had made me, regardless of how my family chose to perceive my achievements. Mr. Harrison Blackwell's office occupied the 15th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a spectacular view of the Rocky Mountains. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a warm smile, directed me to a leather chair in the waiting area. The office had the hushed, serious atmosphere of a place where important decisions were made and life-changing documents were signed. Original oil paintings of Colorado landscapes decorated the mahogany-paneled walls, and the thick carpet muffled all sound except for the quiet hum of air conditioning. At exactly 10 o'clock, Mr. Blackwell emerged from his private office. He was a distinguished man in his early 70s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an air of scholarly authority. His handshake was firm but gentle, and his expression carried a gravity that made my stomach tighten with apprehension. "Miss Torres," he said, his voice carefully modulated, "thank you for coming on such short notice. I know this has been a difficult time for your family, and I appreciate your punctuality despite the circumstances. Please, come into my office. We have quite a bit to discuss." His office was even more impressive than the waiting area, with built-in bookshelves containing legal volumes and what appeared to be a considerable collection of Colorado history books. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface organized with the precision of someone who dealt with complex legal matters requiring absolute attention to detail. Mr. Blackwell gestured for me to take a seat in one of the two leather chairs positioned in front of his desk. "Before we begin," he said, settling behind his desk and opening a thick folder, "I want to express my condolences on your father's passing. I know this meeting comes at a particularly challenging time for you and your family." His words stopped, me cold, confusion flooding through me like ice water. I stared at him, trying to process what he had just said, certain that I had misheard or misunderstood something fundamental about why I was there. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "but my father isn't dead. I just saw him yesterday at our family reunion. There must be some mistake. I was told this meeting was about important family business, but nobody mentioned anything about my father having passed away." Mr. Blackwell's expression shifted to one of profound surprise, then what appeared to be genuine distress. He removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, clearly using the time to gather his thoughts before responding. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications I couldn't yet grasp. "Miss Torres," he said finally, his voice gentle but firm, "your father passed away early this morning. According to the information I received from the hospital, he suffered a massive heart attack sometime around 3 a.m. He was pronounced dead at 4:37 a.m. at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital. I assumed you had been notified by your family before coming here today." The words hit me like physical blows, each one requiring separate processing as my mind struggled to reconcile this impossible information with the reality I thought I understood. My father, who had been so vibrantly, cruelly alive just 18 hours earlier, declaring me his biggest mistake to a room full of relatives, was dead. The man who had dominated every family gathering with his commanding presence and definitive opinions had simply ceased to exist while I was sleeping peacefully in my Capitol Hill apartment. "That's impossible," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I could hear how hollow they sounded. "He was fine yesterday. He was healthy, energetic, talking about business plans and family legacy. How could he just be dead?" Mr. Blackwell reached across his desk to offer me a box of tissues, his expression filled with compassion for someone receiving devastating news in the most unexpected circumstances. Heart attacks can be sudden and unpredictable, even in people who appear to be in good health, he said quietly. Your father had been dealing with some health concerns that he kept private from the family. High blood pressure, early signs of arterial disease. His cardiologist had been monitoring the situation, but apparently the stress of recent months had taken a greater toll than anyone realized. Recent months. The phrase echoed in my mind as I tried to understand what could have been causing my father's stress. Torres Construction Company was thriving under Kevin's management. The family finances were solid. What kind of stress could have been affecting him so severely that it contributed to a fatal heart attack? The immediate practical questions began, flooding through my shock. Had Nicole been contacted? What about Kevin? Why was I, the designated family disappointment, receiving this news from a lawyer rather than from my brother or mother? The logistics of death seemed impossibly complex when layered on top of the emotional devastation of losing a parent, even one whose final words to me had been so devastatingly cruel. "I need to call my family," I said, reaching for my phone with trembling hands. They must be dealing with funeral arrangements, hospital paperwork. I don't understand why I'm hearing this from you instead of from them. Mr. Blackwell held up a gentle hand, stopping me before I could dial. "Miss Torres, there's more you need to know before you contact your family. The reason I called this meeting, the reason you're here today, is because your father left specific instructions about how his estate should be handled. Instructions that I believe will come as a considerable surprise to everyone, including you." He opened the thick folder on his desk and withdrew a legal document that appeared to be dozens of pages long. The letterhead indicated it was the last will and testament of Robert Antonio Torres, dated just 3 months earlier. The recent date struck me as significant. My father had updated his will recently, while apparently dealing with health issues that no one in the family had been aware of. "Your father came to see me in June," Mr. Blackwell explained, handling the document with the reverence due to someone's final legal wishes. He wanted to make substantial changes to his estate planning. Changes that reflected what he described as a period of serious reflection about his family relationships and his legacy. He spent considerable time discussing each of his children, their characters, their contributions to the family, and their potential for carrying forward what he had built. The irony was almost unbearable. 3 months ago, while I was immersed in my research on cardiac monitoring devices, my father had been meeting with lawyers and apparently reassessing his relationships with his children. The same man who had publicly humiliated me yesterday had been privately considering my place in his legacy and making legal decisions based on those considerations. "I don't understand what this has to do with me," I said, though even as I spoke, I could feel my perspective beginning to shift in ways I couldn't yet articulate. "Yesterday, you heard him tell a room full of people that having me was his biggest mistake. Whatever he decided about his estate, I can't imagine it reflects positively on the daughter he considered such a disappointment." Mr. Blackwell's expression was unreadable as he carefully positioned the will document between us on his desk. "That's exactly what makes this situation so complex," he said. "Because the contents of this will tell a very different story about your father's feelings regarding you and your siblings. A story that I suspect will be as shocking to you as it will be to the rest of your family." He opened the will to a page marked with a yellow sticky note and began reading in his measured, professional voice. "To my daughter, Amanda Elena Torres, who has consistently demonstrated the intelligence, integrity, and determination that represent the best qualities of our family name. Despite my failures to adequately recognize and support her achievements during my lifetime, I have observed with pride her commitment to improving the lives of others through her scientific research and her refusal to compromise her values for social acceptance or family approval." The words were so unexpected, so contrary to everything I thought I knew about my father's opinion of me, that I wondered if I was hallucinating from shock. I stared at Mr. Blackwell, waiting for him to explain that he was reading from the wrong document, or that there had been some clerical error in the will preparation. Amanda's choice to pursue biomedical engineering despite family pressure to join Torres Construction Company demonstrates the kind of independent thinking and principled decision-making that I failed to appreciate until recently. Her doctoral, Research on cardiac monitoring devices represents exactly the kind of innovation and dedication to improving human welfare that I should have celebrated rather than criticized. Mr. Blackwell paused in his reading to look at me directly. "Your father was quite specific about wanting these sentiments included in the will," he said. "He spent considerable time crafting this language, making sure it accurately reflected his evolving understanding of your character and accomplishments. The emotional whiplash was almost unbearable. Less than 24 hours after being publicly declared my father's biggest mistake, I was listening to his lawyer read testament language that praised my integrity and independence. The contradiction was so complete that I couldn't process which version of my father's feelings represented his true assessment of my life and choices. "I need to hear the rest," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Whatever he decided about his estate, whatever he really thought about me, I need to understand the complete picture." Mr. Blackwell nodded and returned to the document. "Therefore, to Amanda Elena Torres, I leave the entirety of Torres Construction Company, including all assets, contracts, intellectual property, and business relationships. I trust that her analytical skills, ethical standards, and commitment to excellence will guide the company toward continued success while maintaining the integrity that has always been its foundation." The silence that followed this reading was absolute. I stared at the lawyer, certain that I had misheard something fundamental about what he had just announced. Torres Construction Company, the business my father had spent 30 years building, the legacy that Kevin had been groomed, his entire life to inherit, had been left to me. The daughter who had been criticized for pursuing impractical education, who had been accused of failing to understand family responsibility, who had been publicly declared a mistake just yesterday. "That can't be right," I said, my voice barely audible. "Kevin is the vice president. He's been working at the company for over 10 years. He's married with children. He's the one who understands the business and has relationships with all the clients. I don't know anything about construction or commercial building. This has to be some kind of error." Mr. Blackwell shook his head, his expression grave but certain. "There's no error, Miss Torres. Your father was extremely specific about his reasoning, and we spent several meetings ensuring that his wishes were clearly documented and legally sound. But there's more you need to hear before you fully understand his decision-making process." He turned to another marked page in the will. "To my son, Kevin Robert Torres, who has worked diligently in the family business but has demonstrated a tendency toward shortcuts and ethically questionable practices that concern me deeply. While Kevin has contributed to the company's financial success, I have observed patterns of behavior that suggest he lacks the moral foundation necessary to lead an organization that bears our family name." My mind reeled as I tried to process this assessment of Kevin, the golden child who had always been presented as the perfect Torres family representative. What patterns of behavior could my father have observed that would lead him to question Kevin's ethical standards? What had Kevin been doing at Torres Construction that had caused such serious concerns? Recent investigations into company practices have revealed that Kevin has been overbilling clients, using substandard materials while charging for premium specifications, and maintaining relationships with subcontractors who employ undocumented workers at below minimum wages. These practices not only violate the legal and ethical standards I established for Torres Construction, but represent exactly the kind of moral compromise that I cannot allow to continue under our family name. The revelations were staggering. Kevin, who had always presented himself as the responsible business leader, had apparently been engaging in exactly the kinds of unethical practices that could destroy both the company's reputation and its legal standing. My father, despite his public praise for Kevin's business acumen, had been privately documenting patterns of behavior that revealed serious character flaws. Therefore, to Kevin Robert Torres, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my fishing equipment, with the stipulation that he must seek employment outside of Torres Construction Company within 60 days of my death. I cannot in good conscience allow someone who has demonstrated such disregard for ethical business practices to continue representing our family name in commercial enterprises. The complete reversal of everything I thought I understood about family dynamics was overwhelming. Kevin, the favored son who had been publicly celebrated and professionally promoted, was being essentially disinherited except for a modest cash payment and some recreational equipment. Meanwhile, I, the daughter, who had been criticized and marginalized, was inheriting the entirety of my father's life's work. What about my mother? I asked, trying to ground myself in practical considerations while my worldview underwent complete reconstruction. What about Nicole? This can't be the entire will. Mr. Blackwell turned to additional pages, his expression indicating that the surprises weren't finished. To my wife, Patricia Maria Torres, I leave our family home in Highlands Ranch, all household furnishings, jewelry, and personal effects, plus a trust fund providing monthly income of $8,000 for the remainder of her life. Patricia has been a devoted wife and mother, and I want to ensure her financial security and comfort. To my daughter, Nicole Teresa Torres, I leave the sum of $200,000 and my blessing for her continued work and education. Nicole has built a meaningful career serving her community, and while she chose not to pursue business interests, her dedication to teaching and mentoring young people represents important service that deserves recognition and support. The allocations seemed fair and generous for my mother and Nicole, but the contrast with Kevin's inheritance was stark. My father had clearly made distinctions between children who had maintained ethical standards and those who had compromised them for financial gain. The realization that he had been observing and judging our choices far more carefully than any of us realized was both gratifying and terrifying. But there's still more, Mr. Blackwell said, returning to the section about me. Your father included additional provisions specifically related to your inheritance of the company. He wanted to ensure that you had the resources and support necessary to successfully transition into company leadership, even though you lack direct experience in the construction industry. He turned to a page near the end of the document. Amanda will receive the full cooperation of longtime Torres construction employees, including project manager Frank Martinez and office manager Susan Chen, both of whom have agreed to remain with the company during the transition period. Additionally, I have established a consulting relationship with Reynolds Business Advisory to provide Amanda with strategic guidance as she learns the operational aspects of running a construction company. The level of detailed planning was astounding. My father hadn't simply decided to leave me the company on a whim. He had spent months preparing for this transition, arranging for experienced employees to support me and professional consultants to guide me through the learning process. The man who had publicly criticized my impractical career choices had privately been creating systems to help me succeed in his practical business world. There's one final element, Mr. Blackwell said, his tone becoming even more serious. Your father included a personal letter to be read only by you. He gave specific instructions that this letter should be delivered after the will contents were explained, but before you make any decisions about accepting or declining your inheritance. He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a sealed envelope, with my name written in my father's distinctive handwriting. The envelope was thick, suggesting a substantial letter rather than a brief note. My hands trembled as I accepted it, recognizing that whatever was contained inside would represent my father's final communication to me, unfiltered by family dynamics or public considerations. I think you should read this privately, Mr. Blackwell said, standing from behind his desk. I'll step out for a few minutes to give you time to process your father's words. When you're ready, we can discuss the legal procedures for formally accepting or declining the inheritance, as well as the timeline for transitioning company operations. Alone in the lawyer's office, surrounded by the trappings of legal authority and final decisions, I stared at the envelope containing my father's last words to me. The contrast between yesterday's public humiliation and today's private vindication was so extreme, that I wondered if I was experiencing some kind of psychological break from reality. The father who had declared me his biggest mistake had spent his final months crafting elaborate plans to ensure my success as his business heir. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope and began to read the most important letter of my life. My dear Amanda, the letter began in my father's careful handwriting. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are learning about decisions that will undoubtedly shock and confuse you. I know that my behavior toward you, especially in recent years, has been hurtful and unfair. What you could not have known is that my criticism and distance were not reflections of disappointment in who you had become, but expressions of my own fear that I had failed you as a father. I stopped reading, overwhelmed by the immediate tone of regret and affection that was so completely contrary to every interaction we had shared in recent memory. This was not the voice of the man who had publicly humiliated me yesterday, but someone entirely different, someone who had been hidden beneath layers of stubbornness and misguided parental strategy. The letter continued for several pages, each paragraph revealing new layers of my father's true feelings and the complex reasoning behind his treatment of me. As I read, the events of the past day began to make sense in ways that were both heartbreaking and profoundly healing, setting the stage for revelations that would completely transform my understanding of family, legacy, and my own worth. The letter in my hands felt like it weighed more than paper should, each word carrying the accumulated weight of years of misunderstanding and carefully hidden truths. My father's handwriting, usually bold and decisive, appeared more careful here, as if he had taken special time to ensure each letter was perfectly formed for this final communication. When you were 8 years old, the letter continued, you built a cardboard city in our basement. You spent weeks designing buildings, creating little people, even installing a lighting system using Christmas lights and batteries. When I came downstairs and saw what you had created, I was amazed by the complexity and thoughtfulness of your design. You had considered traffic flow, emergency services, even green spaces for the cardboard residents to enjoy. That was the moment I first realized you had the mind of an engineer, someone who could see systems and solve problems in ways that went far beyond what I was capable of understanding. I had no memory of this incident, but as I read his description, fragments began returning. The basement workshop where my father kept his tools, the cardboard boxes I had convinced my mother to save from deliveries, the frustration of trying to make the Christmas lights work properly with the battery pack I had assembled. I remembered feeling proud of my creation, but also remembered that my father had seemed distracted when I showed it to him, offering only brief acknowledgement before returning to his newspaper. Instead of celebrating your achievement, I became worried. I knew that your mind worked differently than mine, that you saw possibilities and solutions that were beyond my experience. Rather than nurturing this gift, I began trying to steer you toward more conventional paths because I was afraid I wouldn't be able to guide you properly if you pursued your natural talents. Every time you showed interest in science projects or engineering challenges, I discouraged you because I was terrified of my own inadequacy as a father to someone so much smarter than I was. The revelation was staggering. All those years of criticism about my impractical interests, the subtle and not-so-subtle pressure to consider more traditional career paths, the constant comparisons to Kevin's more conventional achievements. None of it had been about disappointment in my choices. It had been about my father's fear that he wasn't equipped to support and understand a daughter whose intellectual gifts exceeded his own experience. Kevin was easier for me to understand because his mind worked like mine. He approached problems directly, focused on immediate practical results, and was comfortable with the kind of straightforward business relationships that had made Torres Construction successful. When he showed interest in joining the company, I was relieved because I knew how to mentor someone whose thinking patterns matched my own. I could predict his questions, guide his development, and feel confident in my ability to prepare him for eventual leadership. But you terrified me, Amanda. Your questions were too complex, your solutions too innovative, your standards too high. I convinced myself that I was protecting you from disappointment by discouraging your scientific ambitions. But the truth is, I was protecting myself from the humiliation of having a daughter whose achievements might reveal my own limitations. Every time you won a science fair or earned recognition for academic excellence, I felt both proud and threatened. Proud because you were my daughter, threatened because you were becoming someone I couldn't fully comprehend or control. Tears were streaming down my face as I read these words, understanding for the first time the psychological complexity that had driven years of family dynamics I had never been able to fully understand. My father's criticism hadn't been about my failures. It had been about his own insecurities. His preference for Kevin hadn't been about Kevin's superior qualities. It had been about his comfort level with mentoring someone whose mind operated similarly to his own. The irony is that watching you pursue your doctorate despite my discouragement, seeing you build a career in biomedical engineering despite my lack of support, observing you maintain your integrity and principles even when facing family pressure to compromise. All of this taught me that I had been wrong about almost everything. You didn't need my guidance to succeed because you had something far more valuable, an internal compass that consistently pointed toward excellence and service to others. Meanwhile, Kevin's career at Torres Construction had begun revealing character, flaws that I had ignored or rationalized away. His willingness to cut corners, his tendency to prioritize profit over quality, his casual attitude toward ethical standards. These weren't temporary lapses in judgment, but fundamental aspects of his character that I had failed to address because I was so comfortable with his conventional approach to business success. The letter went on to detail specific incidents that had opened my father's eyes to Kevin's problematic practices. Clients who had discovered substandard materials in projects they had paid premium prices for. Subcontractors who had confided their concerns about being pressured to use undocumented workers. Financial discrepancies that Kevin had explained away with increasingly elaborate justifications. Each incident had been relatively minor on its own, but together, they painted a picture of someone whose ethical standards were fundamentally incompatible with the reputation my father had spent decades building. 3 months ago, I made the decision to have Kevin independently audited by an outside accounting firm. What they discovered was worse than I had feared. He had been systematically overbilling clients for materials, pocketing the difference, through a complex system of shell companies and false invoicing. The total amount involved was significant enough to constitute criminal fraud, and the potential liability to Torres Construction could have destroyed everything I had worked to build. When I confronted Kevin about these findings, his response confirmed my worst fears about his character. Instead of accepting responsibility or expressing remorse, he became angry and defensive. He accused me of undermining his authority, claimed that his methods were standard industry practice, and suggested that my ethical concerns were outdated and impractical. He showed no understanding of how his actions had jeopardized not only the company's financial stability, but our family's reputation and integrity. The confrontation my father described must have taken place around the time of my birthday 3 months ago. I remembered Kevin seeming unusually tense during that family dinner, and my father being more quiet and withdrawn than usual. At the time, I had attributed these observations to normal family stress, but now I understood that they had been dealing with a crisis that could have destroyed everything my father had worked to achieve. That night, after our confrontation, I realized that I had been wrong about both of my daughters. I had spent years criticizing you for being impractical and idealistic, while praising Kevin for being pragmatic and business-minded. But pragmatism without ethics is just opportunism, and idealism grounded in competence and integrity is actually the foundation of lasting success. You had spent your entire career focused on improving lives and advancing human welfare, while Kevin had spent his career focused on advancing his own financial interests, regardless of the cost to others. The letter explained that my father had spent the following weeks researching my professional accomplishments in detail, reading my published papers, and consulting with other engineers to understand the significance of my work. For the first time, he had made an effort to truly comprehend what I had been trying to achieve through my career in biomedical engineering. I learned that your research on cardiac monitoring devices could potentially save thousands of lives by enabling earlier detection of heart problems. The irony of this discovery, given my own cardiac issues, was not lost on me. I also learned that your work had been recognized by leading medical device companies, and that you had turned down lucrative offers from private industry in order to continue your research in an academic setting where the focus remained on patient benefit rather than profit maximization. Everything I had criticized you for, your idealism, your focus on long-term impact rather than immediate financial gain, your willingness to invest years in projects with uncertain commercial potential, were actually the qualities that made you exactly the kind of leader Torres Construction needed to ensure its continued success with integrity intact. The letter continued with my father's explanation of how he had spent the past 3 months secretly preparing for the transition of company leadership to me. He had met with key employees to assess their willingness to support a new owner with a different background and leadership style. He had consulted with business advisors about the best practices for transitioning a family business to someone without direct industry experience. Most importantly, he had spent time observing my character and decision-making processes in situations where I didn't know he was paying attention. Last month, when you were dealing with that difficult situation at the Denver Medical Research Institute, I watched how you handled the conflict with your colleague who was trying to take credit for your work. Instead of engaging in office politics or compromising your principles for career advancement, you focused on ensuring that the research continued to move forward for the benefit of the patients who would ultimately use the technology. You found a solution that protected the integrity of the project while maintaining professional relationships with everyone involved. That incident convinced me that you had exactly the leadership qualities necessary to guide Torres Construction through the challenges it will face in the coming years. I had never realized that my father was aware of the intellectual property dispute that had consumed several weeks of my professional life earlier that summer. My colleague Dr. Peterson had attempted to claim primary authorship on a research paper that was largely based on my innovative approach to sensor miniaturization. Rather than engaging in a public confrontation that could have damaged both our careers, I had worked with our department head to establish clear documentation of each person's contributions and ensure that the final publication accurately reflected everyone's work. The resolution had been time-consuming and emotionally draining, but it had preserved the research project and maintained collegiality within our department. The fact that my father had been observing this situation and drawing conclusions about my character and leadership potential was both touching and overwhelming. For years, I had assumed that he was completely uninterested in the details of my professional life. Learning that he had actually been paying close attention, evaluating my responses to challenges, and recognizing qualities in me that I hadn't been sure I possessed was profoundly validating. Yesterday's family reunion was the most difficult thing I have ever done, and I owe you an explanation for what must have seemed like inexplicable cruelty. Dr. Martinez had warned me that my cardiac condition was deteriorating more rapidly than expected and that I might not have much time left to address family business matters. I knew I needed to execute the will changes and ensure that the transition plans were in place, but I also knew that the shift from Kevin to you as company heir would be met with significant family resistance. I made the terrible decision to create a public confrontation that would make it clear to everyone in the family that my choice to name you as my heir was not based on favoritism or sentiment, but on a careful assessment of character and capability. By publicly criticizing your choices and declaring you a disappointment, I hope to demonstrate that my decision to leave you the company was based on objective evaluation rather than emotional preference. The strategy was cruel and wrong, and I knew even as I was speaking those words that I was causing you pain that might never heal. But I was desperate to protect you from the family accusations of favoritism that I knew would come when the will was read. I thought that if everyone believed I disapproved of you, they would be less likely to claim that you had manipulated me, or that my decision was based on anything other than business considerations. I understand now that this approach was cowardly and destructive. I should have found the courage to have honest conversations with the family about my observations and decisions. Instead, I chose to hurt you publicly in order to serve my own strategic purposes. There is no excuse for this behavior, and I do not expect forgiveness for the pain I caused you in what I knew might be our final conversation. The explanation of my father's reasoning was both heartbreaking and infuriating. While I could understand his concern about family dynamics and potential challenges to his will, the idea that he had deliberately humiliated me as a form of protection was almost impossible to accept. The damage to my relationship with extended family members who had witnessed his declaration could never be fully repaired, regardless of what his true intentions had been. By the time you read this letter, you will know that Kevin has been essentially disinherited and that you have inherited Torres Construction Company. You will also know that this decision was not made impulsively or emotionally, but after months of careful consideration and planning. I believe that you have the intelligence, integrity, and leadership qualities necessary to guide the company toward continued success while maintaining the ethical standards that I allowed to deteriorate under Kevin's management. However, I also understand that accepting this inheritance will require you to make significant changes in your life and career. You have built meaningful work in biomedical engineering, and I would never want my death to force you to abandon research that could benefit so many people. That is why I have established the inheritance structure to provide you with maximum flexibility in determining how to move forward. The letter explained that the company inheritance included provisions that would allow me to hire a professional management team to handle day-to-day operations while maintaining ownership and strategic oversight. This structure would potentially allow me to continue my research work while gradually learning the construction business and ensuring that the company operated according to the ethical standards my father had originally established. If you choose to accept the inheritance, you will have access to experienced employees who can teach you the operational aspects of the business, as well as outside consultants who can guide you through the strategic decisions that will determine the company's future direction. If you choose to decline the inheritance, the company will be sold, and the proceeds will be donated to biomedical research institutions, ensuring that the resources are used to support the kind of work that you have dedicated your career to advancing. The choice is entirely yours, Amanda, and whatever you decide will have my complete support and respect. You have already exceeded every expectation I could have had for a daughter, and your future success is assured regardless of whether that success comes through continuing your research career, or through leading Torres Construction, or through some combination of both paths. What I hope you will understand from this letter is that every criticism I directed toward you over the years was a reflection of my own fears and limitations, not an accurate assessment of your character or potential. You have always been exactly who you were meant to be, and I am proud of the woman you have become. My only regret is that it took me so long to find the courage to tell you these truths directly. The letter concluded with a paragraph that brought fresh tears to my eyes, containing the words I had waited my entire life to hear from my father. You are not my biggest mistake, Amanda. You are my greatest achievement. The fact that you became such an exceptional person despite my failures as your father is a testament to your strength, intelligence, and character. I love you more than I ever found the words to express during my lifetime, and I am honored that you are my daughter. Whatever you choose to do with the opportunities I am leaving you, I know that you will approach those choices with the same integrity and thoughtfulness that have characterized every decision you have made throughout your remarkable life. I sat in Mr. Blackwell's office, holding my father's final words and trying to process the complete reversal of everything I had believed about our relationship. The man who had publicly declared me his biggest mistake had privately considered me his greatest achievement. The father who had consistently criticized my career choices had spent his final months creating opportunities for me to succeed in ways I had never imagined possible. The emotional whiplash was almost unbearable, but underneath the pain and confusion was something else. A growing sense of clarity about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. My father's letter hadn't just explained his behavior. It had revealed strengths and qualities in me that I had never fully recognized or appreciated. For the first time in my life, I was seeing myself through the eyes of someone who truly understood and valued what I had accomplished. When Mr. Blackwell returned to his office, he found me staring out the window at the Rocky Mountains, the letter still clutched in my hands. His expression was gentle and patient, clearly recognizing that I needed time to process both the practical and emotional implications of everything I had learned. "This changes everything," I said quietly, not looking away from the mountains. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my father's opinion of me, about my place in the world. I don't know how to reconcile the man who wrote this letter with the man who humiliated me yesterday in front of our entire extended family. Mr. Blackwell settled back into his chair, his expression thoughtful. In my 40 years of practicing law, I've learned that people are often much more complex than they appear on the surface. Your father struggled with many competing emotions and priorities. His love for you was never in question, at least not from my perspective during our meetings. But his ability to express that love in healthy ways was clearly compromised by his own fears and limitations. He paused, then continued with careful consideration. "The question now is what you want to do with the information and opportunities he has left you. This inheritance comes with significant responsibilities, but also with unprecedented freedom to determine your own path forward. You have time to make these decisions thoughtfully, but eventually you will need to choose how to honor both your father's legacy and your own values and aspirations." As I prepared to leave the lawyer's office, carrying documents that would legally transfer ownership of Torres Construction Company to me, I realized that the most difficult part of this entire process still lay ahead. I would need to contact my family members who had no idea that my father had died, or that his will contained revelations that would fundamentally alter all of our relationships with each other. Kevin, who had spent his entire adult life preparing to inherit the family business, would learn that he had been essentially disinherited for ethical violations that the rest of the family didn't even know about. My mother would discover that her husband had been dealing with cardiac problems and family business crises that he had kept completely hidden from her. Most challenging of all, I would need to decide whether to accept an inheritance that would require me to completely restructure my life and career, taking on responsibilities I had never sought, and entering an industry I had never imagined being part of. The letter had given me permission to decline the inheritance without guilt, but it had also revealed possibilities for combining my scientific background with business leadership in ways that could potentially benefit both my research, interests, and the construction company's future. As I walked out of the Blackwell and Associates building and into the bright Colorado sunshine, I felt simultaneously overwhelmed by the magnitude of the decisions ahead and empowered by the knowledge that I finally understood the truth about my father's feelings and the worth of my own accomplishments. The journey from yesterday's public humiliation to today's private vindication had been emotionally devastating, but it had also been profoundly liberating. For the first time in my life, I was free to make choices based on my own assessment of my capabilities and values, rather than trying to win approval from someone whose criticism had never been an accurate reflection of my worth. The drive back to my apartment passed in a blur of competing emotions and racing thoughts. Denver's afternoon traffic moved around me while I sat at red lights clutching my phone, staring at contacts I would need to call but not yet ready to dial. How do you tell your family that the patriarch has died and simultaneously reveal that everything they believed about family dynamics was built on carefully constructed deceptions? My phone had been buzzing intermittently with text messages, but I hadn't been able to bring myself to check them during the meeting with Mr. Blackwell. Now, as I pulled into my apartment building's parking garage, I finally looked at the screen. 7 missed calls from Nicole, 4 from my mother, 3 from Kevin. Dozens of text messages with timestamps showing they had been arriving steadily since early morning. The most recent message from Nicole, sent just 20 minutes ago, made my stomach lurch. Amanda, something's wrong. Mom called crying about Dad being at the hospital, but she wasn't making sense. Kevin says there was some kind of emergency. Nobody can reach you. Please call me back immediately. I realized that my family had been trying to contact me all morning, while I was learning about my father's death and inheritance from a lawyer instead of from them. The disconnect was almost surreal. While I had been processing the most shocking revelations of my life, they had been frantically trying to piece together fragments of information about a medical emergency they didn't fully understand. Before I could lose my nerve, I called Nicole. She answered before the first ring finished. "Amanda, thank God," she said, her voice thick with anxiety. "Where have you been?" Mom got a call from the hospital early this morning, but she was so upset she couldn't explain what happened. Kevin drove over there, but he's not answering his phone now. I've been trying to reach you for hours. I took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would change everything for my sister. "Nicole, I need to tell you something, and it's going to be very difficult to hear. Dad died early this morning. He had a heart attack. He's gone." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then I heard Nicole's sharp intake of breath, followed by a sound that was part sob, part gasp of disbelief. "That's not possible," she whispered. "He was fine yesterday. He was talking, arguing, being his usual impossible self. People don't just die overnight when they seem perfectly healthy." "Heart attacks can be sudden," I said, repeating what Mr. Blackwell had told me. He apparently had some cardiac issues that he kept from the family. The stress of recent months took a toll that nobody realized was so serious. "Recent months?" Nicole's voice sharpened with confusion. "What stress?" "Torres Construction is doing well. The family is fine. What could have been causing him stress significant enough to trigger a heart attack?" I hesitated, knowing that answering her question would begin the process of revealing the full extent of my father's hidden knowledge about Kevin's business practices. But there was no way to have honest conversations with my family without addressing the reasons behind my father's decisions about the company inheritance. There's more, Nicole. Much more. I spent the morning meeting with Dad's lawyer about his will. The contents are going to shock everyone, especially Kevin. But I can't explain everything over the phone. Can you come to Denver? We need to have this conversation in person, and we need to figure out how to tell Mom and Kevin together. Nicole agreed to drive up from Colorado Springs immediately, and we arranged to meet at my apartment in 2 hours. That would give me time to process my own emotional state and prepare for what would undoubtedly be one of the most difficult conversations of our lives. After ending the call with Nicole, I forced myself to listen to the voicemail messages that had accumulated throughout the morning. Kevin's voice grew increasingly agitated with each message. The first one, left around 8 a.m., was relatively calm. "Amanda, there's been some kind of medical emergency with Dad. Mom is really upset and not making much sense about what happened. Call me back so we can coordinate getting to the hospital." By the third message, left around 10:30, his tone had become sharper. "Amanda, where the hell are you? We're dealing with a family crisis here and you're completely unreachable. This is exactly the kind of irresponsible behavior that Dad was talking about yesterday. Call me back immediately." The final message, left just before noon, carried an edge of anger that felt familiar from countless childhood arguments. "I don't know what your problem is, but disappearing during a family emergency is unacceptable. Mom needs support right now and you're nowhere to be found. When you finally decide to join the family crisis, I'll be at Mom's house trying to handle everything that you should be helping with." The evolution of Kevin's messages from concern to blame was predictable, but still painful. Even in the midst of grieving our father's sudden death, he couldn't resist framing my absence as evidence of character flaws, rather than considering that there might be circumstances he wasn't aware The irony that he was criticizing my sense of family responsibility while being completely unaware of his own impending disinheritance for ethical violations was almost overwhelming. My mother's voicemail messages were harder to listen to because they revealed the depth of her emotional devastation. Her first message, left around 7 a.m., was barely coherent through her tears. "Amanda, honey, something terrible has happened. Your father. The hospital called. I can't. Please call me back as soon as you get this." Her second message, left an hour later, showed slightly more composure, but revealed how isolated she felt in dealing with the crisis. "The hospital is asking about funeral arrangements and legal matters, but I don't know anything about your father's recent planning. He handled all the business affairs, and I don't even know who to call. Kevin is on his way over, but I really need all of my children right now." The revelation that my mother was completely unaware of my father's recent legal and financial planning added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. She would not only need to process the grief of losing her husband, but also discover that he had been making major decisions about health issues and business matters without including her in those discussions. I spent the time before Nicole's arrival trying to organize the information I would need to share and preparing myself emotionally for the reactions I was about to witness. The legal documents Mr. Blackwell had given me were spread across my kitchen table. The will, the business transfer paperwork, insurance documents, and contact information for the employees and consultants my father had arranged to support the company transition. Looking at these documents, I was struck again by the thoroughness of my father's planning and the magnitude of the responsibility he was placing on my shoulders. Torres Construction Company employed over 40 people, maintained contracts worth millions of dollars, and had a reputation in the Denver construction industry that had taken 3 decades to establish. The idea that I would soon be responsible for all of these relationships and obligations was both thrilling and terrifying. Nicole arrived exactly 2 hours after our phone call, her face showing the strain of processing grief while driving through mountain traffic. She looked older than her 29 years, the weight of sudden loss evident in her posture and expression. When I opened my apartment door, she stepped inside and immediately pulled me into a fierce hug that we both desperately needed. "I'm so glad you're here," I said, fighting back tears that had been threatening all afternoon. I couldn't face this alone, and there's so much to explain that I don't even know where to start. "Start with what you learned today," Nicole said, settling onto my couch with the focused attention she brought to complex problems. "Tell me everything the lawyer said, and then we'll figure out how to help Mom and Kevin process all of this information." I began with the basic facts about my father's death and the circumstances that led to my meeting with Mr. Blackwell. Nicole listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as I explained the timing and the lawyer's surprise, that I hadn't been notified by the family before arriving at his office. When I reached the part about the will reading, Nicole's attention sharpened even further. Her background in science education had taught her to process complex information systematically, and I could see her organizing the details I was sharing into categories that would help her understand the full implications. "You inherited Torres Construction," she said, her voice carrying disbelief rather than jealousy. "The whole company? What about Kevin?" "He's been working there for over a decade. He's been planning his whole life around eventually taking over the business." I took a deep breath and began explaining what I had learned about Kevin's unethical practices and my father's discovery of the systematic fraud that had been taking place at the company. Nicole's expression shifted from disbelief to shock to something approaching anger as I described the overbilling schemes, the substandard materials, and the exploitation of undocumented workers. "This explains so much," she said quietly when I finished describing Kevin's business practices. "Remember last Christmas when Kevin was bragging about the big bonuses he'd been earning? And how he and Jessica were talking about upgrading to that expensive house in Cherry Hills? I wondered how a construction company vice president could afford that kind of lifestyle. but I assumed Dad was being exceptionally generous with Kevin's compensation. The conversation continued for over an hour as I shared the contents of my father's letter and the emotional journey of learning about his true feelings regarding my career and character. Nicole cried when I read the parts about our father's fear of my intelligence and his regret about failing to support my scientific ambitions. She was angry when I explained his strategy of publicly humiliating me at the family reunion in order to protect me from accusations of manipulating him for inheritance purposes. That was the cruelest thing he could have done, Nicole said, her voice tight with indignation. Making you believe that you were his biggest disappointment when he actually considered you his greatest achievement. I understand his reasoning, but the emotional damage he caused with that performance was completely unnecessary and unfair. We spent considerable time discussing the practical implications of the inheritance and the choices I would need to make about accepting or declining the responsibility of running Torres Construction. Nicole was supportive but realistic about the challenges involved in transitioning from biomedical research to construction company leadership. You've never shown any interest in the construction industry, she pointed out. Your passion has always been medical research and helping patients through technological innovation. Are you prepared to give up work that you love in order to honor Dad's wishes about the company? The question went to the heart of my internal struggle. The letter had given me explicit permission to decline the inheritance and pursue my research career, but it had also revealed possibilities for combining business leadership with my scientific background in ways that could potentially benefit both domains. The decision felt too large and complex to make in the immediate aftermath of grief and shock. I don't have to decide immediately, I said, showing Nicole the legal documents that outlined the transition timeline. Mr. Blackwell explained that I have 60 days to make a final decision about accepting or declining the inheritance. That gives me time to learn more about the company operations, meet with the key employees Dad arranged to support me, and really think through all the implications. But first, we need to tell Mom and Kevin what we learned today. They're both dealing with grief and confusion, and they have a right to understand what Dad was thinking and planning during his final months. Kevin especially needs to know that Dad discovered his business practices and that those discoveries influence the inheritance decisions. Nicole nodded grimly. That conversation is going to be brutal. Kevin has built his entire identity around being the successful son who would inherit the family business. Learning that he's been essentially disinherited for ethical violations is going to devastate him, especially since he doesn't even know that Dad was aware of what he'd been doing. We agreed that the conversation with our mother and Kevin needed to happen as soon as possible, both for practical reasons related to funeral planning and business transitions, and for emotional reasons related to helping our family process the complex layers of grief and revelation we were all facing. Before we left my apartment to drive to our mother's house in Highlands Ranch, Nicole raised a question that I had been avoiding thinking about directly. "What about the extended family?" she asked. "Everyone who was at the reunion yesterday heard Dad declare you his biggest mistake. When they learn about the inheritance, they're going to be confused and possibly suspicious about what really happened between Dad's public statements and his private decisions." The extended family complications were indeed significant. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who had witnessed my public humiliation would now see me inheriting the family business while Kevin, the apparent golden child, received only a modest cash inheritance. Without understanding the full context of my father's discoveries about Kevin's business practices, they might conclude that I had somehow manipulated a dying man for financial gain. "I'll cross that bridge when I come to it," I said, though I knew the extended family dynamics would eventually need to be addressed. Right now, I need to focus on helping Mom and Kevin process the immediate realities. Everything else can wait until we've handled the crisis at hand. As we drove toward Highlands Ranch, I found myself thinking about the broader implications of the day's revelations. My father's death had not only removed the dominant figure from our family structure, but had also exposed the hidden dynamics and secret knowledge that had been shaping his decisions for months. The family that had gathered yesterday for what seemed like a routine reunion had been fundamentally altered by events that none of us had seen coming. The woman who had left the community center yesterday believing she was her father's greatest disappointment was returning to the family today. As the inheritor of his life's work and the recipient of his deepest respect and love, the transformation was so complete that I still felt disoriented by the magnitude of the change in my understanding of my place in the world. Kevin's car was already in our mother's driveway when we arrived, along with several other vehicles that suggested extended family members were already gathering to offer support and help with funeral arrangements. The sight of these familiar cars reminded me that our private family crisis would soon become a more public matter, as relatives, friends, and business associates learned about my father's death and began the process of paying their respects. As Nicole and I walked up the front steps of the house where we had all grown up, I realized that we were about to have one of the most difficult conversations in our family's history. The next few hours would determine how our relationships with each other survived the revelations about our father's hidden knowledge, secret decisions, and the vast gulf between his public and private assessments of his children's worth. Stakes couldn't have been higher, and there was no way to predict how Kevin and my mother would respond to learning that everything they thought they knew about family dynamics had been built on carefully constructed deceptions designed to protect secrets that were finally being exposed. The familiar scent of my mother's lavender air freshener hit me as Nicole and I stepped through the front door of our childhood home. The house buzzed with the subdued energy of sudden grief, voices speaking in hushed tones from the living room, where family members had gathered to offer comfort and assistance with the overwhelming logistics that follow an unexpected death. My mother appeared in the hallway almost immediately, her eyes red and swollen from hours of crying. She looked fragile in a way I had never seen before, as if my father's death had removed some essential support structure that had been holding her upright for decades. When she saw me, her face crumpled with fresh tears, and she reached for me with desperate need. "Amanda, where have you been?" she whispered against my shoulder as I held her. "I've been trying to reach you all day. Everything is happening so fast and I don't understand any of it. The hospital wants decisions about arrangements, but your father never discussed any of this with me. I don't even know what he would have wanted." The admission that my father had kept his final planning completely hidden from my mother added another layer of pain to an already devastating situation. She was not only processing the loss of her husband, but discovering that he had been making major decisions about health issues, legal matters, and business affairs without including her in those conversations. "I'm here now, Mom," I said, gently guiding her toward the kitchen where we could have more privacy. "I have information that will help explain some of Dad's recent planning, but we need to sit down and talk through everything together. Is Kevin still here?" "He's in the living room with Uncle Frank and Aunt Helen," she replied, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Kevin has been wonderful today, handling all the phone calls and trying to coordinate everything. I don't know what I would have done without him managing all the details." The irony of Kevin being praised for managing details while being completely unaware that he was about to learn of his disinheritance for ethical violations was almost unbearable. In a few minutes, his role as the responsible son handling family business would be permanently altered by revelations that would shake his understanding of his place in our father's assessment of his character. Nicole and I exchanged glances, both recognizing that the moment of truth had arrived. There was no way to ease into the conversations we needed to have, no method for softening the impact of learning that our father had died while harboring secrets that would fundamentally change how we all understood our family relationships. "Mom, I need you to ask Kevin to come into the kitchen," I said gently. "I met with Dad's lawyer today and learned information that affects all of us. We need to discuss it together before we make any arrangements or contact anyone else about what happened." My mother's expression shifted to concern mixed with confusion. "What kind of information? What lawyer? Your father never mentioned meeting with any lawyers recently. Why would his lawyer want to meet with you instead of with me or Kevin?" The questions revealed the depth of my father's secrecy about his final months of planning and decision-making. My mother, who had been married to him for 35 years, had been completely excluded from knowledge about his cardiac problems, his investigation into Kevin's business practices, and his extensive will revisions. "Just ask Kevin to join." "Us," I said, not wanting to begin explaining until everyone who needed to hear the information was present. "This is going to be difficult for all of us, but we need to face it together." When Kevin entered the kitchen, his expression was tense with the stress of managing a family crisis while dealing with his own grief. He looked tired and frustrated, carrying the weight of responsibilities he had assumed in the absence of clear information about what had actually happened to our father. "Finally," he said, his tone carrying familiar impatience. "Amanda, where have you been all day? Mom needed support and you were completely unreachable. This is exactly the kind of behavior that Dad was criticizing yesterday. You can't just disappear when the family needs you." The accusation, delivered in front of our grieving mother and my supportive sister, crystallized everything that was about to change about Kevin's understanding of his favored status in our family hierarchy. His confidence in his moral authority, his assumption that our father's criticism of me represented accurate assessment, his belief that he was the responsible family member while I was the disappointment, all of these certainties were about to be shattered by information he had no idea was coming. "I was meeting with Dad's lawyer, Kevin," I said calmly, placing the legal documents on the kitchen table where everyone could see them. "Learning about arrangements Dad made before he died. Arrangements that are going to surprise all of us, but especially you." Kevin's expression shifted from irritation to confusion as he registered the implications of what I was saying. "What arrangements? What lawyer? Dad never mentioned any recent legal meetings. Why would he be making arrangements without discussing them with the family?" "Because he discovered information about Torres construction that changed his perspective on a lot of things," I replied, meeting Kevin's eyes directly. "Information about business practices that he couldn't ignore or rationalize away. Information that influenced every decision he made about his estate planning." The color began draining from Kevin's face as he realized that I was alluding to something specific and potentially damaging. His confident posture shifted slightly, the first sign that his certainty about his standing with our father was beginning to crack. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction he had displayed moments earlier. "Dad was supportive of my work at Torres Construction. He praised my contributions to the company's growth and profitability. Whatever you think you learned today, you're probably misunderstanding something." Nicole moved closer to our mother, recognizing that the next few minutes would be emotionally devastating for everyone in the room. My mother looked back and forth between Kevin and me, sensing that we were approaching revelations that would explain some of the confusion and secrecy that had characterized the final months of her husband's life. "Mom, Kevin, I need you both to listen carefully because what I'm going to tell you will be shocking and painful," I began, picking up the will document that Mr. Blackwell had given me. Dad spent the last 3 months of his life investigating irregularities at Torres Construction. He discovered that Kevin had been systematically defrauding clients through overbilling schemes, using substandard materials while charging for premium specifications, and exploiting undocumented workers through subcontractors who violated wage and labor laws. Kevin's face went completely white as I laid out the specific charges that our father had documented during his investigation. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out as he realized that denying these accusations would be pointless if our father had actually conducted a thorough investigation with outside auditors and legal consultation. "That's impossible," he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad never said anything to me about concerns or investigations. If he had questions about business practices, he would have discussed them with me directly instead of going behind my back." "He did confront you, Kevin," I replied, referencing the information from our father's letter. 3 months ago, when the audit results confirmed his suspicions. According to his notes, your response was to become defensive and angry rather than accepting responsibility or showing remorse. You told him that his ethical concerns were outdated and impractical, and that your methods were standard industry practice. The memory of that confrontation was clearly visible in Kevin's expression, as the details I was sharing triggered his recollection of a conversation he had probably tried to forget or rationalize. His confident denial was crumbling as he realized that our father had not only discovered his unethical practices, but had documented his reaction to being confronted about them. My mother was staring at Kevin with growing horror as she processed the implications of what I was revealing. Her younger son, the one she had always been able to rely on for responsible decision-making, had been engaging in criminal fraud that could have destroyed the business her husband had spent 3 decades building. "Kevin, is this true?" she asked, her voice trembling with the need to understand how the son she trusted could have betrayed the family business so completely. "Did you really steal money from clients and exploit workers? How could you do such things?" Kevin's composure finally broke completely under the weight of his mother's devastated questioning, and the realization that his carefully hidden activities had been thoroughly exposed by our father's investigation. Tears began streaming down his face as years of justifications and rationalizations collapsed in the face of direct confrontation. "I never meant for it to go so far," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "It started small, just minor adjustments to material costs to improve profit margins. But clients kept demanding lower bids, and I was under pressure to maintain company growth. The practices became more extensive because that was the only way to stay competitive while meeting Dad's expectations for financial performance." The explanation revealed the depth of Kevin's self-deception about his criminal activities. He had convinced himself that systematic fraud was a necessary response to business pressures, rather than a fundamental failure of character and ethics. Even now, facing the consequences of his choices, he was still trying to frame his actions as reasonable responses to external circumstances. "Those weren't minor adjustments, Kevin," I said firmly. "Those were criminal fraud schemes that put the entire company at legal and financial risk. Dad discovered that the total amount involved was significant enough to potentially destroy Torres Construction's reputation and trigger federal investigations. You weren't adapting to business pressures. You were stealing." The harsh reality of his situation was finally sinking in, as Kevin realized that our father's knowledge of his activities explained the secrecy and stress that had characterized the final months of his life. The man he thought had been proud of his business acumen had actually been documenting evidence of his criminal behavior and planning legal strategies to protect the company from the damage Kevin had caused. "Now I need to explain what Dad decided to do about the situation," I said, picking up the will document. "Because his discoveries about your business practices influenced every decision he made about the estate distribution and company succession." Kevin looked up at me with desperate hope, probably expecting that our father's disappointment would be balanced by recognition of his years of service to the company and his importance to the family business operations. "Dad left Torres Construction. Company to me," I said simply, watching Kevin's expression shift from hope to disbelief to devastation. "The entire business, all assets, contracts, and relationships. He concluded that your ethical violations made you unsuitable to represent the Torres family name in commercial enterprises." The silence that followed this announcement was complete and devastating. Kevin stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language, unable to process that the inheritance he had spent his entire adult life preparing for had been given to the sister he had always been taught to consider less practical and less valuable to the family legacy. "You?" he finally whispered, his voice filled with incredulity. "You don't know anything about construction or business management. You've spent your whole career in research laboratories. How could Dad possibly think you were better qualified to run Torres Construction than someone who has worked in the industry for over a decade?" "Because integrity matters more than experience," I replied, quoting directly from our father's letter. "Because someone who has spent her career focused on improving lives and maintaining ethical standards is exactly the kind of leader Torres Construction needs to recover from the damage that your practices caused to its reputation." Kevin's devastation was transforming into anger as he began to grasp the full implications of his disinheritance. Not only had he lost the business he expected to inherit, but he was learning that our father had considered his character fundamentally unsuitable for leadership responsibility. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising with indignation. "You manipulated a dying man to steal an inheritance that rightfully belongs to me." Dad was obviously not thinking clearly in his final months, if he made decisions this irrational. Any court would recognize that these will provisions don't reflect his true intentions. The accusation of manipulation was exactly what our father had predicted and tried to prevent through his cruel performance at the family reunion. His strategy of publicly criticizing me had been designed to protect me from charges that I had influenced his estate planning through emotional manipulation or undue pressure. Kevin, Dad spent months planning this transition with lawyers, business consultants, and key company employees, I said, maintaining my calm despite his escalating anger. These weren't impulsive decisions made by someone not thinking clearly. These were carefully considered choices made by someone who had finally seen the full extent of your ethical failures and their potential consequences for the family business. I reached for my father's letter, knowing that Kevin needed to understand the depth of our father's disappointment and the careful reasoning behind his decisions. But before I could begin reading relevant sections, Kevin's anger exploded into full rage. "I'm going to challenge this will in court," he declared, standing abruptly from the kitchen table. "No judge will believe that Dad actually intended to leave a construction company to someone with no business experience while disinheriting the son who built his career in the industry. This whole situation is obviously the result of manipulation or mental incapacity." The threat of legal challenges was not surprising, but it was painful to witness Kevin's complete inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of his own actions. Rather than acknowledging that his unethical practices had legitimately disqualified him from inheriting the family business, he was choosing to blame everyone else for his situation. "You can challenge the will if you want, Kevin," I said quietly. "But you should know that Dad documented everything thoroughly. The audit results, the evidence of your fraudulent practices, records of his confrontation with you about the situation, and detailed explanations of his reasoning for all estate planning decisions. Any legal challenge will require disclosure of all that information in court proceedings that will become public record." The implications of public exposure finally seemed to penetrate Kevin's anger as he realized that challenging the will would require revealing the criminal activities that had led to his disinheritance. The legal proceedings he was threatening would expose him to potential federal fraud charges and destroy any remaining reputation he had in the construction industry. As Kevin stormed out of the kitchen, my mother sat in stunned silence, trying to process the complete destruction of her understanding of her family dynamics. The son she had relied on for responsible leadership had been engaging in criminal fraud, while the daughter she had been taught to consider impractical had been chosen by her husband to inherit and lead the family business. Nicole moved to comfort our mother while I gathered the legal documents that would guide the next phase of my life. The revelations of the day had been devastating for everyone, but they had also been liberating. The truth about our father's real assessment of his children's character and potential was finally exposed, replacing years of deception with painful but authentic understanding. 3 months later, I stood in the Torres Construction Company main office, reviewing quarterly reports that showed steady improvement in both financial performance and client satisfaction since implementing new ethical standards and oversight procedures. The transition from biomedical research to construction company leadership had been challenging, but surprisingly fulfilling, combining my analytical skills with meaningful work that contributed to community development while maintaining the integrity our father had originally established. Kevin had ultimately decided not to challenge the will after consulting with attorneys who confirmed that his fraud activities made any legal challenge both expensive and potentially incriminating. He had found employment with a smaller construction firm in Arizona, far from the Denver business community where his reputation had been permanently damaged by his unethical practices. My mother had gradually recovered from the shock of learning about the hidden dynamics that had shaped her family's final years. She had found comfort in understanding that her husband's love for all his children had been genuine, even when his ability to express that love had been compromised by his own fears and strategic miscalculations. Nicole had become my closest advisor and confidant as I navigated the complexities of business leadership while maintaining my research interests through consulting relationships with medical device companies. The sister who had always been caught in the middle of family dynamics had emerged as the bridge between our old family structure and the new reality we were building together. The family reunion that had seemed to mark my definitive rejection from the Torres family legacy had actually been the beginning of my true acceptance into it. The father who had declared me his biggest mistake had spent his final months ensuring that I would understand my worth and have opportunities to build something meaningful from the foundation he had established. Standing in the office that was now mine, surrounded by evidence of honest work and ethical business practices, I finally understood what my father had been trying to teach me through his complex and painful final strategy. Sometimes the most profound expressions of love require difficult choices that can only be fully understood in retrospect. The wine-stained dress from that terrible family gathering was now stored in my closet as a reminder that our lowest moments can sometimes precede our greatest transformations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.